All right, jumping back in here with the Industrial Revolution. We are looking at the impact of the Industrial Revolution, which, looking at the impact, demonstrates to us that this is not an era. The Industrial Revolution is not an era, it's a change. It's a change in the trajectory and the direction of history. It's a change in culture, the way people live, how they relate to one another, how the globe relates to one another. And it's a change that's not all positive. There are some beautiful, wonderful things that come out of it, and we will try to take a look at those. Some of the science that we see is astounding and beautiful and helpful and having an impact even now during this pandemic. But some of the things that is a result, some of the things that are a result of the Industrial Revolution are quite negative, as we are going to see. One of the main themes is exploitation of people and of resources. We were meant to be in relationship with one another. And what the Industrial Revolution tends to do is turn people into business opportunities and resources, and that's not how it should be. So let's take a look. One of the things that we should say is that there are different sort of phases of the Industrial Revolution. Um, Certainly, you have some insight into that as you live in an age of technology. That's one of the phases of the revolution, but that's of course a very recent phase. If we look back, we could see what we might call the second industrial revolution in the late 1800s. From the 1700s into the early 1800s, we have productivity changing, and it's textile industry based. Of course, steam engines play a big role too. But then you get into the late 1800s, you start to see communications change quite a bit. And also some serious lifestyle changes. These are not new names to you. Maybe Marconi is a new name to you, so I won't spend so much time on them. But just a reminder that some serious changes are happening. One of them is Thomas Edison, and of course he's very famous for inventing the light bulb. His Menlo Park studio of inventors in New Jersey were prolific. But one of the things that's true about them is that they were capitalists. They were trying to make money. They weren't just solving problems, and they weren't just trying to ease humanity's burden. They were trying to make money. And so it became pretty fierce in terms of competitive drive. And you can see that very clearly when you think about Thomas Edison and his involvement in the electric current debate. He and Tesla were in quite a race to become the inventor that sort of provided energy for the world. And the debate between AC, DC, and all those different types of currents got pretty heated. There's even the point where Thomas Edison goes so far as to electrocute an elephant in public, trying to demonstrate that Tesla's way of doing electricity was dangerous. It's probably actually true to say that Thomas Edison's way of doing it was more dangerous than Tesla, but it's shocking, right? They're actually electrocuting elephants in front of men, women, and children to get an advantage, an economic advantage. That's what we're talking about here. This is fierce competition, and I want you to sense that as one of the major shifts that we should see about the Industrial Revolution. People become commodities. People become resources. People become really just a business opportunity. We have to push back against that as Christians. There's obviously Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone. And it's really interesting to me that actually the telephone really isn't sort of a universal thing in the United States until like the 1960s. Even into the 70s, actually, there's parts of the country where there weren't telephones. Can you imagine that? Now, for the well-off, that was, not true. They had telephones much earlier, but places like Appalachian Mountains, telephones are really actually rather recent. And actually, even as your parents were growing up, they may remember, my parents do, maybe your parents are still young enough they don't remember this, but people didn't even have individual lines. They had what were called party lines, and so like a whole street would be on the same telephone line, which meant like you could listen into your neighbors' conversations if you were that kind of person, I guess. Your phone would ring in various ways to alert which household who the phone call was for, but the phone would ring in everyone's house um, when someone was making a phone call, and so you heard the ring, you thought, oh, that's ours, and you would pick it up. There's even changes, recently towards making this a more universal thing. Marconi is maybe the less known name, and he's actually another example of really fierce economic competition because Marconi is an Italian inventor who's credited with developing wireless communication. But the truth is, he basically stole the technology. I mean, this happens routinely in this era. In the 1800s, you've got, Samuel B. Morse getting credit for Morse code, but he actually stole that technology. Marconi gets credit for wireless communication, but he actually steals the ideas from others. Now, he's relentless in his pursuit of demonstrating the efficacy of the technology, and maybe he gets credit for that. But what he was able to do is actually communicate wirelessly from Ireland to Canada, the shortest distance across the Atlantic. And then very shortly after that, you know, uh, ships and boats out at sea were communicating with one another using this wireless communication. And it revolutionizes things. It makes things change much more rapidly than they would have otherwise. And then I thought it'd be worthwhile talking about the Wright brothers. I'm sure you know who they are. Credited with being the first heavier than air aircraft to fly, because we have to keep in mind hot air balloons were actually pretty prolific in scientific inquiry and even military use during the 1800s. Zeppelins, we might think of them as blimps, preceded the planes that the Wright brothers made. But what we have here is heavier than air aircraft, and that's obviously really fascinating what they were able to achieve, and it changes everything. It makes the world a smaller place. Now today, you can go to the other side of the world in literally hours. The world is only 18 hours apart now. You can get to the actual other side of the world in 15, 16 hours, depending on what city you live in. You might have to have a connecting flight or two, but that's amazing. One of the things that happens, though, as people are treated as commodities and resources, and it becomes really heavy economic competition, is there is a very predictable response in terms of ideologies. Now, these ideologies are not themselves going to be beautiful or perfect, and obviously we could say some of them lead to really, really heavy suffering. For instance, Karl Marx and the communism that comes from his ideology is responsible for a lot of death during the 20th century, a lot of suffering. I don't think it's quite fair to say all of that is directly related to Karl Marx, but people certainly used his ideas to justify what they were doing. So what we have here is a working class group of people. We talked about how they have long hours and low pay, and there's disease, and it's unsafe, and they're being taken advantage of. And so what you end up seeing is a few people try to react to that. One guy that's worth mentioning is named Robert Owen. He actually is going to work in both England and in the United States. And his idea was that maybe it would be possible to set up like a utopian society where everyone is equal. It's kind of a socialist, communist idea, certainly, but really simple, community-based, small communities, not massive governments. The one that he sets up in the United States is actually in Indiana. It's called New Harmony, Indiana. And it was basically just supposed to be sort of a farming artist commune where people would come together and live in community and take care of one another, and they would use the farming to produce enough food to take care of the society. The problem that he ran into is not everybody was nearly as idealistic as he was. It ran into people being essentially taking advantage of the community. not working, not contributing, just taking. And that's obviously one of the classic weaknesses that you might see in a critique of any kind of utopian society or maybe communism. The much more famous name is obviously Karl Marx. And the reason we have to talk about him here with the Second Industrial Revolution is because he looks at the factory system and he says, okay, this is going to lead us to a breaking point. In Karl Marx's mind, there was a trajectory of history, and he thought we were headed somewhere, and he actually thought where we would end up would be very, very positive. But he thought in the meantime, it was the battle between classes, the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, the industrialists and the working class. He thought that battle would lead us to the next stage as people competed with one another and fought for their rights and to be treated more humanely. So he actually thought capitalism and the factories of the Industrial Revolution would lead us to this breaking point. And so that's when he starts to formulate his Marxist ideas. Now we have to be careful. He does not invent communism. What he does is he puts communism inside of a larger story, an ideology, his belief set about what's true of humanity and what kind of universe we live in and where's history headed and what are some of the things that we'll see going forward. That story is where he put communism. He embedded communism inside of his story. And so it's not true to say he invents communism, he just gives it a context. But one of the things that he does say is that it will require a violent revolution to overthrow the industrial bourgeoisie, the professional class, the government ruling class. And with that violent revolution, then we'll be able to settle everything into what we might think of as a utopian communist society. Of course, what that ends up doing is basically justifying violence, especially in the minds of several leaders during the 20th century that are really quite violent. Chairman Mao of China, Pol Pot of Vietnam, Vladimir Lenin and Stalin of Russia. These men are responsible for probably something like 40 million deaths between them. Maybe more. And of course, all of them were saying that Karl Marx was, in at least part, their inspiration. What we're going to be looking at tomorrow is exploitation of not just working class people within your own country, but beginning to exploit other areas like Southeast Asia or Africa, as we will take a look at. This is obviously something we don't have time for today, but just looking at this map, you're going to see that European nations are going to start to colonize these areas, hoping to take advantage of their resources to feed their industrial machines. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. My plan is one more worksheet for the year. It'll be due Tuesday. I'll post it probably tomorrow. And, you just use these videos to answer and you'll be done. I'll just need you to turn in your textbooks next week. You've been getting emails from the school about how to return resources that you've got and also how to get your stuff back. So please be aware of that, cognizant of that, and we would actually love to see you in person and wish you a happy summer. Looking forward to being back in the classroom at some point next year and really doing school the way it was meant to be done. In the meantime, keep up the good work. Miss you guys and proud of you.